Good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Goldin. I'm the director of the school. This is actually the inauguration of this room as a venue for seminars and lectures, and we'll also be showing films here. So welcome. This is a historic moment for us, and I imagine that it's going to be used for hundreds of years to come, starting today. For those of you that might remember it, this used to be a library, so it's a very different space now. The seminar series is focusing on the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations, which we launched last Wednesday, covering a very wide range of issues, and each week we will cover a different one. I today will focus primarily on the background, the overall structure of the Commission, why we did this, some of the broad frameworks for it, and then on particularly the political transition aspects and institutional aspects, and others in the forthcoming seminar series will focus on health, will focus on governance issues and other issues. And I'll go through at the end of the session before you leave so you don't forget upcoming events and upcoming seminars. So see this as a whole set of which you get a partial glimpse today. There are copies of the Commission as you walk out, so do pick one up, and then you'll be better informed when you come next time to engage in the conversation on different aspects of this. So the Commission really arose because of our concern in the Oxford Martin School that the key challenges of the world are not being adequately addressed. We work in the Oxford Martin School on a very wide range of issues, about 300 plus people in 30 plus teams working on issues ranging from pandemics, frontiers of health, to climate, energy, economics, cyber, and many, many other issues. And we think we understand what many of the global challenges are, but we are increasingly concerned that there are inadequate conversations happening, particularly in the corridors of power, in business, and in government, regarding how to take these forward. So there's this very large gap between knowledge and action across many, many different dimensions of what we know has to be done and what is being done. And the other gap is between the short term and the long term. So we feel that people really only want to talk about, preferably yesterday, as news, in other words, what's in the newspapers today, and what might be in the newspapers tomorrow, or what might be in their quarterly reports, or what might be in the mark-to-market accounting, but they are very reluctant to talk about anything which is slightly beyond the short term. And that's in business due to the pressures that are on firms, the tenure of CEOs, the incentive structures of CEOs, and in politics, there's a whole series of different explanations, including short-termism in politics, the electoral cycle, social media, etc. And so we are frustrated that when we talk about issues like climate change, or like preventing the next financial crisis, or about any of the big challenges, that the politicians and the business people who we talk to's eyes basically glaze over as they look at their Blackberries and try and cope with the short-term immediate needs. So how do we overcome, how do we bridge these things? And how particularly do we make the institutions fit for 21st century purpose? So we're concerned to leave the world in a better shape than we found it. We are extraordinarily optimistic. This is certainly the best time to be alive. One's chances of living a long, healthy life are greater than ever in history. The likelihood of war seems lower now than at virtually any time in history. And there are many other reasons to be cheerful, as a very good pop musician once said. So there are reasons to be cheerful, and we are cheerful, but we are worried. We're worried that this particular moment in history is extremely fragile and certainly cannot be guaranteed and is unlikely to last if current trends carry on as we fear they will. So there's a whole series of festering issues which, if left unattended, will boil over and will severely compromise all of these achievements. And many of these issues arise out of our success. They are the other side of success. And I would argue, and have argued in my book Divided Nations, and will be arguing in my forthcoming book Butterfly Defect, that one cannot have globalization and hyperconnectivity without also systemic vulnerability. And this tension between understanding that increasingly as we become more connected, we are also more interdependent, dependent on others, is absolutely central. And that's not only true for individuals, but it's true for societies, for countries as well. So countries depend on each other much more than ever before to be able to move forward as a successful nation. And so too do all of us. So you just imagine any dimension of your lives and imagine it as an island on your own, and you could think very quickly how quickly your lives would dissolve. And that's not only because of your psychological need for other people, and of course for your parents to be here, but it's much more than that. You wouldn't be able to do anything. You would not have the technologies, the food, or anything else. And that's obviously very different to times past, and it's getting more and more that case. In other words, we're more and more interdependent. We are more and more interdependent on places further and further away. The supply chains that provide everything we consume, be it the energy, the food, the clothing, the internet services, the machines we use to access the internet, etc., come from more and more sources, more and more places, and that creates greater and greater interdependencies. It also creates greater and greater complexity. And these two things, the level of interdependence and the level of complexity, are also very, very closely associated with each other. More and more connections, more and more connections. And with that also comes a difficulty of attribution. The more things come from somewhere else, the less one is able to know where they came from. You don't know who makes your clothes, or who makes your iPhones, or who makes where your food comes from. And you don't know where the banking ATMs get their money from, etc. We just don't understand because of the level of complexity and interdependence. And mostly we don't care, as long as it happens. But when these supply chains break and when complexity unravels, we do need to understand. So what we try and do now for the long term, the report of this is understand, given this interdependency, given this growing complexity, given globalization, given what we know about the global system, how can we move forward? The Commission is composed of a set of wonderful individuals, 19 people, who were chosen because of their experience. Because of their experience in having led very large international organizations, like the World Trade Organization, like the European Central Bank, like UN Women, or because of their experience in national governments. We have a number of ministers. We have the senior minister from China. We have a senior minister, Liu He. We have a senior minister from India, Nandan Nikani, who's actually doing the largest IT project in the world. This is the retina scanning of 1.3 billion people. He was formerly the CEO of Infosys. And we have many former ministers, like the former foreign minister of Brazil. And then we have some intellectuals and academics like Amartya Sen, Nick Stern, and Martin Rees, and others. In fact, we have both the president of the British Academy and the former president of the British Royal Society as commissioners. So this is a varied group, They don't actually represent younger generation, they represent older generation of experience, of people that have been hitting their heads against the walls of these institutions, trying to drive global agendas forward. And so what we were trying to understand is, given that we know that the system is gridlocked, given that we know that we are not making progress on any critical issue, what can we do about it? And some of the issues that we haven't made progress on, we know, because they're happening all the time. The obvious one is climate. And we have a very neat graph in the report which shows the succession of, I think there were about 12 different global climate negotiations, and with each one, atmospheric concentrations just going up and up, nothing happening. We know this in other areas. We know this in cyber, that the cyber negotiations fell apart. And we know this in trade. And that's indeed why Pascal Lamy and I knew each other, because we've been working together on trade matters since the 1990s, since the Uruguay round, when he was the European Trade Commissioner. But the Doha round of trade negotiations, which he's been leading since 2001, are just drifting in the mire, nothing happening. And so he was absolutely dismayed to be leaving the WTO without having succeeded in closing out this absolutely vital global negotiation. So we know that these global negotiations no longer work. And what we try and do is understand why don't they work, and what can we do about it? And there's a number of things that we can learn, and the second part of the report is about trying to learn lessons of what has worked, because not everything has failed. And it's very important when one is deeply frustrated about failure in global governance or when moving agendas forward, to always be inspired by things that have actually happened. And some things happen a lot more rapidly than we anticipate. For example, I would never have anticipated that gay marriage would suddenly become legal in so many societies so quickly. And yet other things don't move. We saw what happened with women's rights, the woman vote. Even, I'm ashamed to say, my college in Oxford, Balliol, which has always prided itself in being a forward-thinking college, I think only accepted women in 1979. It's quite bizarre when we think back on it. But we know things do move, and we know that there have been successes in some areas. There have been quite a lot of successes in the fight against HIV/AIDS and the rollout globally of antiretrovirals. There have been quite a lot of successes in tobacco. Who would have thought that even a French bar or restaurant now bans smoking? I certainly, having lived in Paris for a good chunk of my life, would not have thought that would have happened in my lifetime. And it's happened 10 years after I thought it was unimaginable. And we see other transitions, and of course I see the one from my country, South Africa, where it was regarded absolutely impossible that South Africa would overcome apartheid so quickly, and yet it did in a surprisingly rapid period of time. So why do some things happen and other things not happen? To what can we ascribe this, and what recipe, if it's, Pascal Lamy, who is French, of course, likens this to making mayonnaise. So, you have the right temperature, you have the right ingredients, you have everything in proportion, and sometimes the mayonnaise works and sometimes it doesn't. Why? And what can we learn from this in international politics and negotiations? And then there is a much longer list of things that have not worked. Now, in thinking about why things don't work, there's a number of factors which are related to this political transition, which is the theme of today's seminar. One of them, again, is a reflection of huge success, and that is the rise of new powers, the rebalancing of the world. This is the result of huge increase in incomes and political power around the world. So the US can no longer dominate world politics. We no longer have G1 or G3, which was basically the US, Europe, and Japan. We have a much better, much healthier, and in the long term, much better for the world, global distribution of power. This is wonderful news. It reflects the rebalancing and, in a way, going back to a world that existed many hundreds of years ago when Asia was a dominant power. The problem is, in this political transition, is the handover. Now, what's absolutely clear is that the old powers, the US, Europe, Japan, do not have the interest, the finances, the political bandwidth, the appetite, the capacity to do anything on their own. What was startling in the recent US presidential election was how both presidential candidates competed with each other about how little they would say about foreign policy or climate change or any of the things that we care about. Basically, talking about the rest of the world is a political liability, and showing interest and committing your resources to it. And this reflects both a domestic politics and the bankruptcy financially, as well as intellectually and in terms of political bandwidth of the debate, but it also reflects a recognition that actually power without talking about things without being able to affect them is rather a waste of time. And they're not ready to share power yet. The Sunningdale meeting between the Chinese and US presidents was, I think, very significant. It might be a sign of the beginning of a new power relationship, an early sign. But it's a long way from that to a new G2, which would be the US and China. And Europe, of course, is totally absorbed in its own crisis management, with massive need to resolve domestic problems across Europe in multiple dimensions. Again, no appetite for global leadership, and Japan has been bankrupt and isolated for a long time. So we know this of the old powers. The problem is that the new powers, who now already are well over half of global economic activity, and by 2050 will be 80% of global economic activity. Asia will be over half just on its own by 2035 of global economic activity. These new powers, although they have been very good at preventing progress, of blaming the West for all the problems we've created, bringing up colonialism and all the other things which rightly have contributed to the mess we're in, they've been very weak at problem solving. It's not possible for me to think of any major global issue which has been resolved by the BRICS. So what is it in terms of leadership? So it's in this handover period where the old powers are incapable of leading and the new powers are not yet ready to step up to the plate of leadership, that we have a particularly dangerous time in global governance. We have a dangerous time because of these problems that are bubbling up, because we're entering the perfect storm, and we're in the perfect storm of maximization of demand for global problem solving. And the reason we're in the perfect storm is because of our success, is because incomes are rising more rapidly than any times in history, because the walls have come down and we're interdependent. We need interdependent management. And that's the price of globalization and its success. So as 5 billion people transition from $1,000 per capita to $10,000 per capita over this period, which is happening from the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, about 1990, till about 2020, they maximize their consumption of all products and services. The marginal transfer of income into consumption maximizes around $7,000 per capita for food, for water, for energy, etc. So we have this maximization of demand without coordinated responses. And that's why a tuna was sold in January this year for $1.8 million. That's about £1 million for one tuna. Why rhinoceros horn is now more expensive than gold. Why natural resources prices are going up. And of course, another part of this, which I'll come to in a minute, inequality is going down. It's going up as well. People that are not able to afford these are getting relatively poorer. So individuals are exercising the choice given to them by their incomes. That's wonderful. They're buying their first air conditioning, they're buying their first heating, they're buying their cooking, they're buying their fridges, they're moving from walking to getting a motorbike or a bus, to getting a car, to flying. They're enjoying the benefits that we've enjoyed through using energy over the life cycle. And that's what we want. That is creating a better world for people. It's creating opportunity. They're living longer and healthier lives because they have access to things. But at the same time, they are increasing their food consumption and consumption of all natural resources. So there's this tension between what we want from income growth and what we get in terms of planetary management and resources. This is not not a new issue. In Oxford, we knew 800 years ago, when Port Meadow started collapsing, that as people in Oxford got richer and as they got more goats and some cattle to graze, that unless we did some regulation and coordination, there would be no more grazing. There are two ways to resolve this. One is go and invade other people's land and get their grazing. That was also done, of course. And that's conflict. And the other way is to manage your resource, your common resource. So this tension between income growth and the use of the commons, or the tragedy of the commons, is a very, very old issue, which has been in the center of certainly earlier economic thinking, less and less so. But increasingly, as more and more people in the world feel more and more income benefits and feel the benefits of democracy and freedom and choice, they believe they have the right to choose. And it's this right to choose which now embeds all our thinking. We will choose what we consume. We will not ask our government, or it will not tell us what to consume. And this tension rises as well dramatically from about 1990 as neoclassical economics and the whole paradigm around the choice, the market, becomes the driving force around the world. Increasingly deregulation in all dimensions of society and the view that markets are rational. This ideological bias, this cultural bias, spreading around the world, greatly, greatly exacerbates the problem of global management, because people increasingly believe that the market will tell them how to behave, and that it will clear at the right price, which is rational for society. And this is very dangerous because, of course, we know that it doesn't reflect the tragedy of the commons. It doesn't affect the spillover impact of our own individual choices on others. And that happens all the time. And it happens in ways that are often unanticipated and which we don't really embed in our thinking. It makes a lot of sense for me to fly around to conferences. And actually, it might make some sense for me to enjoy slightly warmer weather in Oxford and to be able to have a barbecue in the summer. But of course, the tragedy will be felt by the 30 million Bangladeshis who are washed away by rising oceans. This divorce between our own choices and the spillover impacts is one which is in all dimensions. Antibiotic resistance is one that's going to rise very dramatically as another example of this. We all take antibiotics, we give antibiotics to our loved ones, and yet we know that if we all do it, they will become ineffective. The tension between individual rationality and collective outcomes is very evident. And of course, it's compounded by the fact that not only are antibiotics being applied for human use, but now increasingly in other applications. So well over half of antibiotics now are used for animal feed production or animal production, and they're even being painted on the hulls of ships to make ships move slightly faster because the barnacles don't grow on them when they're painted with antibiotic paint. So getting into all the different water systems, land systems, and developing bacteria with antibiotic resistance. So we know this, but it doesn't stop us getting antibiotics. And of course, when we try and apply heavier and heavier regulations in societies where you can still buy antibiotics over the counter, we get pushback against that. So how we manage in this is absolutely critical, and how we particularly manage the power transition. How are we going to ensure that, given that we know that the global system is unfit for 21st century purpose, how do we manage all this? Well, the institutions that were created after the Second World War mainly, like the United Nations, like the Bretton Woods institutions, which is the World Bank, the IMF, World Trade Organization, and then a whole series of others that came into being in the 60s, largely came out of crises. They largely rose phoenix-like from the Second World War. And we saw this extraordinary invigoration of the global governance system after the Second World War. It was a response to the mass destruction that happened then. And people at that time felt able to give up some sovereignty in order to prevent another catastrophe. They felt able to empower their governments to empower supranational institutions, institutions which were above any one nation state. Of course, at that time, there were also a lot fewer countries. About 70 countries have come into being since then. And there were really only a very small number of countries with power. Firstly, because a lot of countries had been smashed by the war, like Germany. And secondly, because power distribution in terms of economic activity was highly concentrated in the powers, the victor powers. About 80% of global economic activity at that time was in the hands of the victor powers. So it was a small group of people who were able to sit together in a closed room, smoking their cigars as they did, all men, basically writing the global rules. And they did it, and they were allowed to, and actually it's been pretty successful in some respects. The problem now, of course, is we have 202 countries. We don't believe that men should be allowed to smoke cigars in closed rooms and make global rules anymore, rightly. And not only do we have 202 countries, we have lots of other players. So the Rio +20 negotiation, for example, which also ended in failure, had 19,800 accredited NGOs. That did not happen in the Bretton Woods negotiation or in the League of or the UN creation. And of course, as within each government, you had multiple actors. You didn't just have one person coming from a country saying, I will act on this country's behalf, whatever I agree with you, I will get my country to agree. You have some complex negotiation between different coalitions and ministers within different governments. And basically, as soon as people walk out the door, you have instant media. What did you say? You know, I want to know what you said. If there isn't, indeed, if people weren't in the room with you, monitoring what you said. So the ability to strike deals is basically gone. The ability to form deals based on all countries is gone. And I'm personally, and I should stress that this commission was 19 people, and I certainly can't speak on behalf of all of them, but I'm very pessimistic about the prospects for global agreement on anything of significance. Because there will always be winners and losers. And unless one develops a system where supermajorities are able to exercise power, the idea that everyone will see an alignment of interests or be able to come to the party is, I believe, optimistic. This is particularly difficult in democracies. And obviously, one of the things we have to ask ourselves in this debate is, are democracies less effective at dealing with long-term challenges than non-democracies? And what does that mean for our preparedness for the future? But in democracies, the short-termism is becoming absolutely endemic in all dimensions of activity. And so basically kicking the ball into touch, or as I think of it rather, as kicking the hand grenade slightly further down the road, so that the next person who takes up the relay of governance will have it exploding in their face, is the nature of the game. Inability to make tough decisions. When will we get a decision on Heathrow Airport or on runway in the south? I think what a lot of people say is we'll be lucky if it's in our lifetimes. This inability to make decisions in various dimensions. So what we propose in the Commission is thinking of new structures. And one of them is this idea of reinvigorating the existing institutions. It's remarkable that not a single institution that's been created at the multilateral level in the past 65 years has been closed down. Okay, the institutions that were created in the 50s or 60s to fight totally different battles limp on. And that's because they are funded generally by a small aid, a country. They have their headquarters in that country. The country likes them being there. The civil servants that work for them keep their housing markets, keep their restaurants, etc. going in some way. And they have a vested interest and they come on. So although a lot of these institutions are kept on drip feed and have very, very poor funding, they don't get closed down. I was on the UN Reform Task Force. Chair Gordon Brown was one of the chairs at the time. It was when Kofi Annan was Secretary General. Stoltenberg, the former Prime Minister of Norway, was on it, Prime Minister of Tanzania. It was a great team. And we made, I think, very sensible recommendations on how to untangle the spaghetti bowl of international governance in the UN system. 19 different agencies working on water, for example. How to try and rationalize this. That report, I'm sure none of you have ever heard of it, is probably gathering dust on another UN shelf. So lots of bold attempts to rethink the system, but very little ability to actually really move it in a concrete way. So one of the proposals in the Commission is to introduce sunset clauses, which is a suggestion really driven by this desire to reinvigorate the global governance system and to ask ourselves the question, is this institution still fit for 21st century purpose? Is it an institution that deals with the challenges we have? And if not, should it be closed down? That's an option. Should it be reskilled, restaffed, reinvigorated in other ways? But a formal process for all publicly funded institutions to ensure accountability and a refresh of the system. And it might well be that a number would be merged. Now, this sounds so rational and sensible that it should be implemented. I don't think it will be because of all the vested interests. But you have to build coalitions around these, coalitions of the working. Unfortunately, the invasion of Iraq really did a lot of damage to the whole concept of coalitions of the willing. So we don't use that term. We use the term coalitions of the working. But the basic idea, we feel, is one that we're going to have to go forward with. In other words, you cannot wait for all parties to agree everything before you do something if a critical mass believes, of countries that are legitimate actors, believes it's the right thing to do. And then the obvious question is, what is critical mass and how do you decide whether it's legitimate? And my sense of this is that one needs to ensure that in any of these coalitions, you have both the affected and the affecting in the room agreeing. So on climate change, for example, you would want Bangladesh or the Maldives or someone like that in the negotiation. They are the affected as well as the critical affecting. In climate change, we know that actually about 20 countries account for 90% of carbon emissions. You don't actually need a global agreement. In fact, an agreement of only 20 countries would make a fundamental difference to the outcome. And the question is, does that include the US? Which it obviously should. But should we wait for the US to have a climate agreement? And when will that come? And our strong view is that you cannot wait. These issues are too important. And they accumulate with time in their importance. In other words, decisions postponed are decisions escalated. They get worse and worse the longer you wait. The resolution becomes more and more difficult and more costly. So our view is that a coalition of 20 countries with 30 cities, key cities, and 40 big multinational companies who committed to advancing the climate debate, to cutting carbon emissions, to doing other actions on energy efficiency and in other ways, would make a difference. It would make a real difference to the outcome, but it would also make a real difference to building political constituencies and political momentum behind change. So in the US, we know, for example, that there's a number of very significant cities, like New York, like Los Angeles, who actually are doing the right thing. Ahead, way ahead. There's states like California that are doing the right thing, way ahead of their government. So don't wait for the US government, move ahead, and move ahead with an alliance of cities and also big businesses who are prepared to show, as some are. Unilever, for example, is committed to cutting its carbon emissions by 80% by 2020. This is a remarkable thing. So putting them out there as leaders and saying, this can be done. Let's not make the gridlock in the global governance system an excuse for inaction. Let's move. Let's move on these issues, getting coalitions of the working behind change and move agendas. One can do it in other areas as well. We've got a proposal for fit cities, what we call fit cities. And we'll hear in our seminar on health how significant non-communicable diseases have become, now accounting for about 70% of deaths in the world. And increasingly, although infectious diseases remain very significant, increasingly this is a global issue. In other words, developing countries is just a big issue as it is in the advanced economies, where things like diabetes, obesity, etc., are as significant as they are in the advanced economies. But these are things, as Mayor Bloomberg showed in New York, that can be advanced at the city level. You can ban fizzy drinks. You can enforce in your schools healthy diets. You can do many, many things at the city level which don't need to wait for the national or global agreement. Yes, it'd be great if there was various agreements at the WHO on various dimensions, as there have now been on some issues regarding, for example, road deaths with safety belts and some issues around smoking and others. But we cannot wait for these things. So the idea of creating coalitions, the idea of not waiting for the lowest common denominator to move what we believe is important. And as individuals, we need, I think, increasingly to feel empowered ourselves to take action, not to think, kick the problem upstairs, kick the problem to the politicians, and then blame them when they do nothing. So how do we do that? And think about these different dimensions. And as I say, we have a number of different examples. Of course, information and transparency is extremely important in all of this. So one has to move from knowing about the issue, what I would call knowledge, to an awareness that this is important, to a mobilization. We can actually do something. Let's mobilize to do it, to an action. Let's make it happen, and it happens. And it's that transition, which is a transition which I think we increasingly have to go to close this bridge between knowledge and action. Now, this is not necessarily dependent on the nature of the political system. What I've been talking about in terms of these coalitions could work equally in China or in a non-democracy as it could in a democracy. Citizens in Shanghai or in Beijing could themselves, the cities, and they are. The city of Beijing, for example, is taking various actions on various dimensions. Of course, in the end, nations are important. I'm not suggesting for a second that coalitions of the working are a substitute for global agreement in all respects. In the end, only governments make the rules. Only governments can put you in prison. Only governments really have power to tax and spend. These coalitions can do it at the city level and in other levels, but they can't, in the end, change the rules for everyone. And it's the free riders that one needs to, in the end, account for. But the Commission's sense is that this is a process, that we have to move along these ways. There are other areas where you see a similar thing. We were very frustrated by the lack of progress on cyber. We know that the collapse of the global cyber system fundamentally threatens the nervous system of the world. This is the new nervous system for communication, for information, for financial transactions, for everything we know and operate on. It's very difficult to imagine the world without the internet and cyber system. We also know that it's becoming more and more embedded in all aspects of our lives. Our Future of Humanity group and Future of Technology and Society groups see a world in which we will be interfaces in our bodies, in our brains. That's the future. It's going to happen in different ways. But imagine this world where we don't know what it is, and it's not reliable. That identities can be stolen, distorted. The whole system can be snapped. This interdependency will be most acute in the cyber world. But we also know that there are no rules. There's no international legislation around cyber. If someone from Russia steals all the money out of my local bank account, I can't go and get them, and nor can the bank. So how does that operate? Well, we've been very lucky in the school to get the award for the UK Cybersecurity Centre, which we'll be establishing. Indeed, some of it will be based in this building. What we have to develop is, firstly, an information sharing and trust as to what's going on. And one of the problems at the moment is that everyone hides their data and hides their information. Businesses don't want to reveal how vulnerable they are because they think it's a competitive disadvantage to them to reveal that they've been attacked and that their systems are vulnerable. Governments, of course, won't tell us anything because it all happens in the secret world where it really matters to them. And governments don't want to exchange the information because it's also seen as a new form of warfare and military power. So we want to try and break that cycle, and one of the proposals in the document, in the report, is the creation of a cyber platform, CyberX, what we call CyberX, which is an exchange, to develop a capacity. Now, not everyone has to participate. Again, this is a coalition of the working. But as long as you have enough people participating and they share enough information, you can develop the frameworks, the rules and regulations, the encryption technologies and the other means to create a more stable cyber system, at least for those that participate in it. We have similar proposals in other areas, on statistics and in other areas. So the idea is to bring people together that want to move agendas and not allow those that don't to stop. We also need to understand in the end that this is about ideology and culture. The culture that we are individuals and that we are right, that our individual choice should always be paramount, that regulation is basically bad. We don't want people to tell us what to do, needs to be broken. We need to understand that the more interdependent we are, the more we are going to have to coordinate and accept common rules. You cannot have globalization and interdependency without some more common rules if you want a sustainable future and a better life for the next generation. So we have to accept this, and we have to accept that the race to the bottom in regulation, which is one of the key causes of the financial crisis, is not sustainable. So some understanding of this is, I think, absolutely vital as we go forward. The idea that the market will give you the right outcome, I think, has been pretty clearly demonstrated through the financial crisis, through the failure of so many other commons, to be an idea which is totally unfit for the world we live in. So if we value interdependence and interconnectivity as the source of our strength, of our income growth, of the decline of poverty around the world, which I do, then we have to ensure this is increasingly going to be a coordinated thing. Now, when you look at the politics in the democracies, and not least the UK, you do not see any evidence that globalization and increased integration has led to a deeper sense of interdependence. So UKIP, the Independence Party, got 24% of the vote in the recent municipal elections. The UK is going to have a referendum about pulling out of Europe. Scotland's about to have a referendum about pulling out of the UK. We want to kick the foreigners out, etc. This is not, to me, evidence of an increasingly joined up view of the world or of interdependency. On the contrary, it seems to be a reaction against being joined up. The problems come from over there, the financial crisis comes from over there, the pandemics come from over there, all the terrorists come from over there, the cyber attacks come from over there, and climate change is coming from over there too now. So it's all coming. Let's just build higher walls and try and make things more local. We want to see our politicians' eyeballs. We want to know they are accountable. We don't want them in Brussels or Washington or anywhere else. And this, of course, is right in some sense. It's certainly understandable psychologically. The problems will come from over there. They're likely to. All the key drivers of the future of the UK will come from over there. It's very difficult for me to think of any big thing that's going to shape the future of this country, or indeed any country, even the biggest countries like the US and China, that won't be very strongly, increasingly determined for things that come across their borders. And it's also very understandable that people feel threatened by it, because not only the opportunities, but also the threats, the pandemics, the financial crises, the other events will come from outside our borders. And it's also understandable that people feel that they want to look their politicians in the eyeball because they feel they're not accountable. So all of these things are very understandable. Unfortunately, when you put them all together, what you cook up is a disaster. Because what you cook up is societies which isolate themselves, which turn their back on globalization, and that, of course, is the last way you want to manage it. You cannot manage this hyper-joined-up system by trying to withdraw from it, by saying we will not empower the global institutions, we'll starve them, we don't actually want to spend a lot of our time thinking about them, and we don't want to be part of the global problem solving. That is a sure way to ensure that whatever happens out there has very negative effects. So what we try and do in the Commission is have a view of the world which is, we're not starry-eyed. I don't think you can accuse this particular group of people that we got as commissioners as being in any way naive. They're certainly not academic. There are a couple of wonderful academics, including a Nobel Prize winner. But this is a group of very hard-nosed, very experienced people with lots and lots of scars on their back. But this group of people is desperately worried that the achievements of their lifetimes, of all of our lifetimes, are at threat. And unless we move, the prospects for future generations will be much worse than our own. So it's an attempt to think about how can you move it? What can we do as citizens? What can businesses do? What can governments do? It's a contribution to the debate. It's certainly not the beginning or the end of the debate. And we hope that it will be effective with that. Thank you. So we have about 40 minutes for discussion, if you want that long. Yeah, the lady over here.
Hi, Professor Goldin. My name is Jessica Lamb, and I am part of the Merton College Global Directions Group and founder of Women a Year International. In your talk on how globalization can work for the poor last year, you mentioned that North Korea was then the only society that is not connected to the rest of the world. This year, at the Oslo Freedom Forum, Hannah Sung, who runs Liberty in North Korea, mentioned that it is the increase in such connectivity among those within and defectors outside of North Korea, and thus the growing collective empowerment through shared illegal behavior, information flow, grassroots marketization, a breakdown of the narrative created by extreme doctrination, which may lead to a corruption-induced disintegration of the North Korean government. So my question to you is, how effective do you think such gradual disintegration may lead to a democracy in North Korea, or do you think the government may just adapt and reform to such connectivity while maintaining its dictatorship, and what can we do to help? Thanks.
Okay. I should have said that the seminar is being filmed, and we have a choice as to whether we film the Q&A. My preference is to also film the Q&A, but that does mean you need to speak into the mic, which Clara has. I think your question would have been picked up anyway because it was loud and clear. My answer to that is I don't know anything about North Korea. It's not an area that I have any relative expertise in. Indeed, I'm sure there are many people in the room that know a lot more about it, including you, than I do. My own view is that it's going to be increasingly difficult to sustain an isolationist regime. But as I discovered in South Africa, as people discovered in Eastern Europe, as people are discovering elsewhere in many other military dictatorships, it's extremely difficult to predict tipping points and when regimes collapse. There's no good theory about this. The best intelligence agencies, as we saw with Iran and many other places, get it wrong. So it's, I think, some sort of imagined hypothesis on dates or scenarios. Of course, we can all do that, but I would be extremely wary of hazarding a guess on that. Yeah. Why don't you wait for the mic? We'll sort of try and move around the room so Clara doesn't have to run a marathon up and down.
Thank you for your talk. It was very enlightening. I was having trouble with you saying that you argue that the world is very interconnected, which is certainly true to some degree, but still, like the rich nations, they build high walls around them, and it's very difficult, especially for unskilled labor, to come into rich regions to benefit from the good institutions in, for example, Europe and America, and to make a good, decent living. And they were forced to go to places like Dubai and work in the desert heat where it's 50 degrees outside and work for 12 hours a day. And for me, this is a sign that it's not interconnected enough, and that we actually need more kind of international cooperation, especially in regard to migrants, that they're kind of having easier access, like hardworking people who want to climb up the social ladder, that they from developing countries get the opportunity to come to developed countries. And I think national states, especially the rich countries, are one of the main reasons that drive global inequality. That kind of by locking out billions of people from joining their economic systems, and I want to I would be interested in hearing your views on this aspect.
No, I absolutely agree with you. To say that the world is hyper-connected, which I believe it is, does not mean that, and that there's free movement in many things to most places, does not mean that it's totally connected. And certainly you're absolutely right that the movement of people is the big thing that's left out. That, interestingly enough, has gone the opposite way to everything else. All other flows, and you can measure any flows across borders, both goods, services, as well as illegal flows across borders, have increased greatly with globalization. The flows of people as a share of the global population have gone down. Okay? And that's because part of what's been happening over this period is more and more countries have been created. So there's more and more walls. You had these mass movements like out of the Soviet Union after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or as people shuffled back to the republics in the Soviet Union where they then ended up. But subsequent to that, as a share of the global population, even if the absolute numbers are bigger, migration is now lower than it was 100 years ago. And certainly, although people see big headlines around migration, we forget very quickly that passports didn't exist before the First World War for most people. And there's some great novels, which in my book, Exceptional People, How Migration Shaped Our World and Will Define Our Future, I cite these cases where people encounter passports and border controls for the first times in their lives, and the sort of shock and horror. It's also the case that migration was always the way that people escaped problems: poverty, disease, war, conflict, etc. And I certainly wouldn't be here if both on my grandfather on my father's side and my mother hadn't escaped through being migrants. And that's true of many people. So that's how people escape poverty. A third of Ireland migrated, a third of Britain migrated, a third of Sweden migrated or more. 40% of Italy migrated. These were mass movements of people in response to famine, climatic disasters, conflict, or whatever. Very, very big movements of people. And many times in the US's history, where 20, 30% of the population were migrants. So, now we're at 11%. And in the UK, not very far from that as well. There's a great book for those of you that don't believe that the UK is completely mixed up called Bloody Foreigners, about migration into the UK, and just talks about, the kings and queens couldn't speak English until the 12th century. Queen Victoria's first language was German. So we invent this imagined idea of being English in the UK, and everyone does it in other countries too, in whatever country they reconstitute as being their identity. So you're absolutely right that, that this is the contradiction in the system. It's also, you're absolutely right, one of the reasons why inequality is growing, because people can no longer move. And we see the tragedy of Lampedusa, 20,000 people dying in the Mediterranean, it's now estimated, trying to escape the horrors of Somalia, Syria, and elsewhere. And it's not just about, it's about ethics and humanity. Who are we? But it's also about this fragmentation of the law. So the Italians have to absorb them. So there's many, many different dimensions to this, but I think you're absolutely right to highlight that I should have mentioned it, and that it's a key imbalance in the system. Now, I'm not optimistic on this, that we're heading in the right direction. And again, you only have to look at the debate on migration in the UK at the moment to see which way this is going. There's very little evidence that as we become more globalized, we seem to understand this. And that is, I think, for a number of reasons. One is some lack of transference of knowledge into awareness. So, You know, one of the reasons I wrote my book was to try and change mindsets, but unfortunately 3 books have been written since then which tell the opposite story, I think using very bad evidence. So there's an evidence problem. Do migrants take your jobs, or do they create jobs for you? Do they lower wages or raise wages? Do they pay more taxes than they take in social security payments? And on all of these, I'm absolutely convinced by the evidence that the story is positive on the static story. Then you get into the dynamic, okay? What is the future source of growth and opportunity in the UK, with or without migrants? Or in any way. And then you need to look at the data on innovation, on dynamism, on investment, and how societies move over time. So half of the Silicon Valley startups, migrants. Half the patents in the US now, migrants, even though they're 11% of the population. Half the Nobel Prize winners, the Academy Award winners, all of these innovators in different dimensions, migrants. And that you begin to understand the dynamics of what migrants bring to societies. So I'm absolutely convinced, but there's a battle that needs to be fought around the evidence. It's also true that migrants contribute more in tax than they take out of it, for example. So we just need to think about this more deeply. But you're right to say that there's a big tension between a hyper-globalized world and a very, very fragmented and increasingly separated mobility of people. Yeah, the lady at the back.
Hi there. A bit loud, sorry. Thank you. That was lots of food for thought. My name's Anna. I work for Oxfam in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. And I was just struck as you were talking about the idea about the coalitions of the working. You know, the flip side, absolutely. Then the flip side of when you do get a global deal is it stands or falls in terms of how it's implemented at the national or at the local level. And I've kind of got 3 parts to my question. One is I wondered if the discussions looked at regional groupings as a possible way of, going with coalitions of the working, whether that's the old guard of the EU or looking more towards ASEAN or the Commonwealth and the CIS countries. The second question is, I know it's early days in terms of the report's launch, but it'd be great to hear something about how these ideas are being received in some of those on the list in particular, and also it'd be great to hear a little bit about the thoughts about building momentum for that idea, and are there plans to do so?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. On regions and things, and it's interesting that you from Oxfam, one of the cases we use is how you mobilize behind things using common goals, and obviously the MDGs and the whole development story, and how fast it moved behind the MDGs is one of the positive stories we tell, one of the positive examples of how you can mobilize behind common goals and targets. We do look at the regional story, so we look at APEC and ASEAN as success stories. We think, and it's not surprising as Pascal Lamy was in the kitchen making it, that the European single market and the whole creation of Europe is one of the most extraordinary stories. It's the only counterexample, by the way, on the mobility of people. Everywhere in the world, people movement is being stopped, except in Europe, where borders have been dismantled. So it's revolutionary in what it was, the European project. Obviously, there are all sorts of questions now regarding it, but that it happened is just an extraordinary story. So we do look at the regional stories and try and learn lessons from them. In terms of the ripple from the launch of the report, well, the report was launched a week ago. We've had 230,000 downloads of the report on our website. We think that's a lot. 250,000 downloads of the whole report, not the executive summary, in a week. So we're very happy with that. We haven't translated it yet. We really need to very urgently do that. There's been very good media coverage. We've got a lot of pickup in the media. You'll see that 2 of the commissioners are Lionel Barber, the editor of the FT, and Ariana Huffington of Huffington Post. We did that deliberately. We wanted to understand the media's role in forming opinions and mobilizing, so they were a resource, but now they're also very useful for us in dissemination, obviously. So there's a lot happening on Huffington Post around the report. The different members of the commission have been writing op-eds in different areas. So for example, we've had, I forgot how many, but I think we've had about 20,000 downloads in India, and that's in no small part due to Nandan Nilekani having done an op-ed in the Indian newspapers and blogging and twitting around us in India. So how you get that they've played a great role, and we're just at the beginning. We're going to go to the US at the beginning of November. We've got big launches in Washington, in New York, and that will carry on, and we'll do this around the world. In terms of the forward momentum, we're very keen as a commission not to just drop this thing. We were very committed to it. What we do, how we do, we're going to be discussing. We're going to have another meeting of the commission, sort of review what we've done, what its impact has been, what do we do next. The individual commissioners will take it up. But we're also very keen to say, look, this is our contribution. You know, we don't, this is, it's very interesting to ask yourself, why do some activities like this just get put on a shelf and die, and others become turning points or tipping points in public debates and drive things forward? And it goes back to this mayonnaise question. You know, it's not just, and how do you understand the role of social media in this? So some reports we know now, like the Brundtland report and other things, have really made a big difference. Whereas 99% of them die. So how do we ensure that we get the same? And there we would really appeal to you as well. This only will live if people take it up and think it's useful, tell their friends, build on it, take it as their own, drive it forward, change it, do whatever they want to do. We want it to be an absolutely living thing. This is just a suggestion after a year's hard work of ways to move things forward. And our website, we hope, will be a platform for some of that as well. Okay, you, and then we need to get moving around the table because we've only got 20 minutes left and we've only got through 1/3 of the room.
I'm Peter Zilgalvis, the visiting EU fellow at St. Anthony's College here at the University of Oxford. And my question was a follow-up on the coalitions of the working. We actually have something similar in the European Union that's called variable geometry,
Absolutely.
and which is seen by a lot of EU citizens as being quite obtuse and difficult to understand. So my question is, if we will have different groups of countries, cities, etc., engaged in these different coalitions, and you want to engage the citizens to actually implement reducing use of certain fuels, etc., how do you think it could be explained to them whether their country is in one or not in another, and why the coalitions are different in different cases?
Yeah, I think there are, of course, many coalitions out there already operating on many, many, many different dimensions. And some of them have been incredibly effective in moving agendas forward. My sense is that increasingly we all are able to juggle multiple participations, identities, etc. Increasingly people feel part of many societies, part of many different interest groups, campaigns, and I'm amazed when I see people's social media activities, how this juggling becomes more and more globally connected. So I think it's absolutely something we do. I think you can say to someone, you know, you believe it's very important to for example, stop antibiotic resistance, but you also think it's very important to allow the fisheries not to collapse, and you also think it's very important not to have climate change, and you also think, why not? You know, I think we all should feel absolutely able to join as cities, as individuals, as governments, multiple activities. At some point, these things get joined up. So you get a series of debates in the European Parliament or wherever on these topics, which drive them through. In the end, when there are resources that have to be mobilized, you prioritize your scarce resources. But many of these issues don't require resources. They basically require political will and individual will. You know, yes, it would require enormous resources to address climate change, but that's not what's lacking. You know, the resources are trivial compared to many others, and they're much smaller than the resources we'll spend on a new missile system or, you know, aircraft carrier. It's about political will, and it's about people feeling that these things are important. And I think what's happened because of our success, people are complacent. I don't think there's a sense that this party is about to end. We need to take away the punch bowl a bit. That certainly is what people were saying about the financial crisis. And so part of what it's about is understanding the world we're in and how fragile it is, I think, in this process, and how interconnected all these issues are that we engage in. My hope is also that if we can succeed on one issue, and I don't really care which one it is, it will have taught us how to cooperate. Okay, so if we can succeed on climate change, it'll be much easier to succeed on antibiotics, or on managing the global financial system, or on something else. It's about learning to cooperate and learning that your collective outcomes will be better if you can do things in a more joined up way. Yeah.
Hi, I'm John Askinis. I'm a new graduate student in the International Relations Department.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned how important it is to have both the affecting and the affected in the room. That reminds me of a story that Madeleine Albright tells of the Rwandan genocide, and how and the Security Council, when they got some initial intelligence that there was something going on in Rwanda, they turned to the Rwandan representative who happened to be there and asked him if anything was going on. And he said no. And he was a Hutu, and it was the Tutsis who were being slaughtered.
Yeah.
So who is in the room really matters.
Yeah.
And I was sort of, you mentioned that we're beyond the days of white European men sitting smoking cigars. We're not very far beyond those days. And there's a direct link to some extent between the constitutional nature, the governance nature of the countries, and how well minorities and disaffected people within those countries are represented internationally. And so my question to you is, how do you balance that? And to what extent is gridlock just another word for democratic process? Because anytime you increase the number of affected people and marginalized people who are in the room, the more difficult it's going to be to arrive at consensus.
Yeah. No, I think you've put your finger on this tension, which is absolutely there, that we want more participation. The report calls for more transparency, more participation, and yet we want decisions. And we know that the more participants there are, it's not just that you get incremental, you actually get an exponential difficulty. And then you also get some complexity of multiple negotiations, of different balances, etc., and satisfying multiple constituencies. So I think that is a tension. It's one of the reasons why I think we move towards the sort of coalition of the working idea, that you need to move towards ideas of minilateralism or supermajorities or other ways of overcoming, of understanding where consensus lies and being able to drive enough down that to form decisions and give up, presumably after trying, on unanimity. So there will be people who will be angry at the end. The idea that everyone has to agree everything to get something to happen, I think we need to move beyond. And part of that is lobbying. Carbon taxes. The pharmaceutical lobby will not like controls on antibiotics. The fishermen will not like constraints on fishing. We make a very strong pitch in the report for diminishing the absolutely perverse hydrocarbon and agricultural subsidies that exist, which are a scandal in all respects, with very small number of farmers basically extorting the rest of us. Why do we pay 4 times the world price for sugar? It's to make some rich farmers happy in the European Union. Is that right? Is it right for Africa? Absolutely not. These people will not be happy if we create a level playing field on agriculture. So I think we have to accept that the power, and Joe Stiglitz's book, The Price of Inequality, is brilliant on this, and how inequality reinforces inequality. The rich pay for lobbying, they reduce the taxes, and etc. Reduce redistribution. And there will certainly be people who resist change and who have very strong vested interests in the status quo. The question has to be, is this in the interests of the broader society? Is it in the interests of future generations? And do we need to make it at that level? Another point that you raise is most things should not be decided at the national or the global level. So I'm a very strong believer in subsidiarity. Communities, individuals need to decide everything they can. The question is, what is the spillover effects? To what extent will your decisions affect others at your municipal level or your individual level, etc.? Then you have to involve others. And that's where I think we get it. But I think your point on the Rwanda question in this case is absolutely right. Affected people, so not the government or whatever, is absolutely crucial. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Tan Kong from northern Myanmar, very close to the China border. And very related to the Rwanda. I've been to Rwanda in 2009, and I saw the United Nations convoy past the Rwanda border to Democratic Republic of Congo. But when war broke out in June 2011 in northern Myanmar, many displaced people, several thousands of displaced people are locked in the border. China don't accept refugees, and the United Nations agency, they can't support those IDP in the rebelled area. At that time, I was wondering why the United Nations agency in China cannot help those displaced people along the border. The humanitarian principle, it seems that it doesn't work there. So you mentioned that the power, multi-power, are now rising up in different parts of the world. So how we gonna make sure that the powers are responsible power? Thank you so much.
I think the question of ensuring that the world gets better because it has a more even distribution of power is obviously a central concern. Now, I think we have to accept that when the world was governed by one or two powers, it wasn't exactly fair. Terrible atrocities were committed by these powers at different times. So the idea that somehow we're moving from a good system to a bad system, I think, is not a reflection of what the old system delivered. It delivered a whole series of disasters for the world. And that's certainly what the Africans and everyone else point to about colonialism, imperialism, etc., etc. Will a better power balance, let's for want of a better word called the G20 power balance, create a better world? I'm very optimistic. I'm optimistic because I think there will be a stronger mutuality of interests. I think it will represent 90% of or 85% of the world's population. The current G3 powers, by which I mean the US, Europe, and Japan, represent, I think, about 20% of the world's population. This group of countries will represent also 90% of global economic activity. So they will have so when you represent 90% of the world's population and 90% of global economic activity, you have a very strong interest in collective good outcomes. And one of the things that's so optimistic for me about the future is co-investment. The more China invests in the UK, or the more US dollars it has as savings, the less it wants to create a global financial disaster or allow the UK economy not to do well or whatever. So we're interdependent because we also co-invested in our supply chains. Our whole economies depend on mutual success. The idea of one economy doing well at the expense of another is really an idea of a pre-globalized world. And it certainly will become less and less significant going forward. So that's very healthy. We don't want to bomb another country if we're going to go bankrupt and we're not going to have any more iPhones. And spillover effects will be that we will die too. So this interdependence has some very positive impacts. Now, does that mean there will be a dilution of some things like human rights or the right to protect, etc.? I don't think so. When a small group of countries make the rules and the rest don't agree with them, those rights aren't applied anyway. Okay? It's not like the US can set human rights standards everywhere around the world and enforce them. It never could. And anyway, we know it abused human rights in many, many countries in the name of its things. And what did it do in Chile, for example, in history, and many, many other places? So Michelle Bachelet, who's one of the presidential candidates in Chile, is on our commission. So I think it will lead there. The problem is this handover. This problem is this transition time, this perfect storm time we're in. And the transition from a world where we're really rudderless as a world now. There's no power in the world because no one has enough power. The old powers have given up their capacity to rule. The new powers have not yet taken up the baton, and in the middle you get drift. And that's why we see all these global negotiations drift. Nothing is happening of significance in world management. The BRICS at one of their recent summits proposed a BRIC bank as their major contribution. The BRIC bank, nice thing to have. It'll be good. It'll create maybe, if it's lucky, $50 or $100 billion of infrastructure investment in a market which needs 10 trillion. But it's not the story. I mean, how does it relate to any of the things we're talking about? Yes, it's helping them to learn to cooperate, but we need cooperation now. So my own sense is that we need, this thing is too slow given the scale of the demands on it, that we need to accelerate this handover to a G20. I think in 20, 30 years' time, the world will be much better governed. The question is getting there. All right, you, and then we'll have to stop because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a new graduate student at Balliol College, studying financial economics, and I actually spent the summer working at the Institute for New Economic Thinking in New York.
Oh, great.
Of which I know you were founding members. I'm very grateful for the breadth of perspectives you're providing. I've been wondering, so the work or the challenges that the Commission is outlining in the report, I think very much resonates with a common sense among the younger generation that we are not tackling the challenges of the 21st century. And I wonder whether the challenges that the Commission describes are actually also reflected or mirrored on a grassroots or youth, movement level, such that there's a lot of goals that we all share, but there's a lot of groups, basically literally thousands of groups that do the same thing but do not unite. So I have two questions. First, maybe, where do you see this impetus to bridging the gap towards action coming also from maybe youth movements, grassroots movements? And second, what advice would you give in terms of how to unite these movements? I'm not sure whether a kind of screening of which grassroots institutions are relevant would help there. So, thank you.
I think that's also an important point to raise, not least as this is called the Commission for Future Generations. We spent a lot of time in our deliberations trying to meet with youth alliances, youth groups, and some of those are listed in the report acknowledgements, so you get a sense of who we've been speaking to. And there is huge energy and multiple groups, and some of them are surprising, how big the Scouts group is, for example. But there are many, many, many youth groups out there, all who I think have energy, have ideas, and can contribute to many of these things. You're right, and this isn't only a problem of youth. I think it's a general problem. There's just a proliferation of groups out there, often who are not coordinated on any one issue, and clearly if they're united, they would be much more effective. I grew up in a world where it was sort of one person, one party in leftist politics in England, with parties splitting and splitting. And sometimes you see this in youth groups, although they're much better. I think it would be presumptuous to say, how can they move? These things have to be driven by the energy and the desire of individuals and whatever it is. And some of them will be motivated by things like the rights of girls not to be circumcised or mutilated. Some of them will be motivated by climate change or some other issues. And it's not like one's right and the other's wrong. I wouldn't want them to all have to make these choices. I think the fact that there's so much that people can work on, there's so many issues that have to be fought is important. There was a time when I think, I felt that the youth were just sinking into materialistic consumption and actually weren't mobilizing. And I feel again now energy developing around the need to mobilize for action. I think it's incredibly healthy in whatever way it comes. And the more places and the more countries, the more activities it can spread in, I think the healthier it is. Yeah.
Thank you. Guy Fielding, I'm associated with Harris Manchester College. Thank you, first of all, for a wonderful talk. I wondered if you'd comment on the role of the nation state, because it seems to me several times you've said almost paradoxical things. They're very popular, and yet they almost seem to be the locus of a lot of problems, particularly with the kind of us versus them in an interconnected world.
Yeah.
And I wondered what you saw as the future of the nation state.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question, and then because we are running out of time.
Thank you. Kian Minswu, I'm reading the B-Phil for philosophy. I had a quick comment, which is, it seems that if you introduce these coalitions, that's going to help introduce norms into the global world. And if we don't wait for unanimity, this seems like a really good thing. We want to get those norms started and enforced as soon as possible. But my question is, what venues are we going to use for creating these coalitions? Does the committee have a suggestion on which way we're going to go? Because it seems like justification for which venue we're going to choose is really important.
Yeah. The nation state, we have this paradox that the whole world is operating in this Westphalian nation state world, but actually very little does. And the real world is operating in a transnational basis or a local basis or at some other level of organization or business, commercial. So we have nation states which are basically unchanged for hundreds of years, with political systems which are basically unchanged for hundreds of years as the organizing principle. Of course, they keep fragmenting, so we have many more now as well. And they'll keep fragmenting. Who knows, Scotland might become an independent nation state again. These institutions are increasingly unable to shape what will shape our futures for reasons which we outline in the report. Individuals are much more powerful. Individuals for the first time in human history now can kill hundreds of millions of people or destroy economic systems through cyber attacks or through biopathogens attacks. That's different. And their voices can be amplified, as we see with individuals that become these sources of big crowd activity. So that's different. And the supranational level, which should be the new operating level, is actually withering. So I see this paradox between nation states which basically think they're in control but aren't, and individuals increasingly in control, and a global system which is totally basically unfit for 21st century purpose in most dimensions. Some things fortunately work well, like international air traffic control, international postal services. These things do manage to catch up, and it's interesting to ask why, but most things don't. So where do I see this going? I think that nation states are likely to be with us for a very long time. I think we need to understand that we need to operate in addition, not substitutes, but complements on multiple other levels. Professional network levels, coalition levels, city levels. Actually, most of the things that will affect most people's lives will be at the city level. Whether you live in a good or bad city will determine much more of your life than whether you live in maybe a good or bad country in some respects. Cities can join up, and we see this increasingly as well. Anything that matters to people, like getting water, getting food, getting school, getting health, is often at the city level. I think we will operate at very different levels, but I don't predict the demise of the nation state for a very long time. The question of venues, where do these coalitions, where are the platforms and what will they do? Our view as the Commission is very much that this depends on the issue. That you can't, that, you know, some things might happen in a UN or that type of venue, but most things are actually likely to happen based on other sorts of platforms. So for something like Cybex, we propose a new platform, the creation of a new platform. For WorldStat, we similarly propose that. For the cities, countries, business alliance on climate, this we hope will grow organically out of existing things that are happening. So for example, the cities are coming together on climate. There is already a cities initiative. Businesses already have an initiative. And some governments want to move. So our proposal is that they combine and form a common platform on that. So it very much depends on the issue as to where the platform will be. So I hope I've whetted your appetite about what the Commission is, and that you take it away, read it, digest it, tell all your friends, tweet around it, and spread the news. But I hope you also come to the forthcoming seminars, which will draw out the themes around this. So the next one is going to be by Will Hutton, who's actually the principal of Hertford College next door, on jobs and inequality, next Thursday. No, sorry, Thursday the 7th of November. So we're skipping a week. Is that right? Yep. On the 14th of November, on resources, that's going to be Professor Jim Hall, who's the co-director of our program on resource stewardship, with Tara Garnett. On the 21st of November, on governance, norms and transparency, with Professor Simon Caney, who's the co-director of our program on human rights for future generations. And 28th of November, John Frater, Adrian Hill and Andrew Pollard, who run our emerging infections and vaccines groups on global health. And then the final one on the 5th of December, which will be followed by a drinks reception on, Clara, I'm looking for the other list as well, on the whole Commission and the next step. So we will have Professor Sir John Beddington, who is the advisor to the Oxford Martin School, who is the former chief scientist of the UK, and he's now working with us, helping bridge between academia and policy. And we'll have Lord Martin Rees, who's the former president of the Royal Society, member of our commission, and Astronomer Royal, talking about how they would take some of this forward. And they've been people that have really been at the forefront of the interface of academia and the policy. In addition to the seminar series, we have 3 events coming up over this term. The first is Nick Gowing. Nick, many of you from outside the UK will recognize instantaneously as the face of the BBC World TV News. He's been the anchor for many years of TV news, presenting, interviewing, etc. Around the world. And Nick is going to talk about the relationship between new news and instant news and the ability of politicians and businesses to make long-term decisions. So I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating, and crisis management. So Nick is on the 30th of October, a Wednesday, at 4 o'clock right here. We have Al Gore the next day in exam schools, but if you haven't already registered, I'd encourage you not to come because we are way oversubscribed for that. And if you have registered, I'd encourage you to come very early, because we're actually going to operate a first come, first serve principle for those that have registered. And then finally, the other activity we're doing this term is the screening of Pandora's Promise, which is a movie about nuclear power. And that's going to be in here on the 12th of November at 5 o'clock. All of this is on our website, so please take a look, and hope to see you again here soon. And thanks so much for coming today.